Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our IBJR webinar series. My name is Luciano, and I might have met some of you before, so I will try and facilitate today's session. We have the pleasure of having Miss Lee Plum talking to us about neuroplasticity, and I'm pretty sure she's going to make it a very interesting talk and very easy to follow as well. That's it for me for now. I will now pass it on to Lee so she can start her presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be here because I really want to talk to you about neuroplasticity, in particular the good, the bad and the ugly. So my name is Lee Plum. I'm a physiotherapist and I'm also a lecturer at Australian Catholic University. So I lecture in neuroscience for physiotherapy and movement science. To start my talk, what I'm going to do is define neuroplasticity, and then I'm going to give you some examples. And as you'll see from the examples, neuroplasticity, it can be good, it can be bad, and it can also be ugly. I'm going to have a quick chat about what neuroplasticity has to do with knee osteoarthritis. And then I'll summarize with some ideas about what that might mean for you. So when I first started hearing about neuroplasticity, it would evoke images of a brain made out of plasticine. And I'd have these images of poking and prodding the brain to remodel it. Now, just in case you're wondering, the brain doesn't look like that previous picture. It looks more like this one here. So neuroplasticity has no agreed upon definition, and people use this word to mean different things. But I think a common understanding is that neuroplasticity is the capacity of the nervous system to change and be shaped by experience. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the nervous system. So the nervous system includes the brain, the spinal cord, and then all the nerves that go throughout the body. So you'll see how the nervous system takes up quite a lot of space in the body. So our nervous system takes in information about our world. It makes sense of this information, and then it formulates a response based on the information and sends out the plan and messages needed for us to act within our world. So take, for example, if I reached out and touched this person on the toe. So touch receptors in this person's toe would pick up my touch. So the receptors look something like this. They would turn my touch into a message that can be sent to the brain. So first of all, the message is sent up to the spinal cord. So the messages come in here through these nerves and go into the spinal cord. They then travel up special pathways in the spinal cord, right up to the brain. So they travel up to the thalamus, and then for the third stage in the pathway, the message is passed on to a special part of the brain responsible for receiving information about touch. So these pathways here are made up of bundles of neurons. And so the neurons are all laid out neatly together and covered in a protective sheath. These are the ends of the neurons, and they join to the start of the next neuron. Neurons don't actually touch each other to send and receive information. Instead, they send little chemicals, so neurotransmitters, across gaps to pass the message from one point to the next point to the next point. Now, what do you think might happen if instead of reaching out and touching this person's foot nicely, I grabbed a hammer and banged it down on the person's toe? So in this case, two messages, in fact, are sent up to the brain. So these two messages travel up specialized pathways for receiving potential damaging messages about potential damage to the body. So the message is sent up to the spinal cord, then from the spinal cord to the thalamus, and again from the thalamus to that specialized part of the brain responsible for interpreting touch, in this case, potentially damaging touch. So once the message reaches the brain, this person might decide to act upon those messages. So some potential actions the person might take include saying ouch and hopping around, holding the foot. For the person to say ouch and to hop around, a message needs to be sent from the brain down the spinal cord and then to the muscles responsible, for example, responsible for contracting the leg out of the way of the hammer, or contracting the muscles in the mouth and throat to say ouch. All this stuff happens in context. So all the information that we receive and the actions we perform happen within a context. And they're based on what's happening in the environment, what resources we have available to us, and what experience we have with those messages and actions. When messages are sent up and down pathways many times, the pathways become very well worn and the messages become much more efficient at going up to the brain and then coming back down from the brain. This partly explains why once we start doing something a particular way, it can be hard to break that habit and form new ways of doing things, because we get really used to messages going up to the brain and down from the brain in particular ways. And we have to work hard if we then want to change and create a new pathway. When messages are sent up the brain in particular ways, particular neurons are fired off. And there's a saying that neurons that fire together wire together. And this is part of how neuroplasticity starts to occur. So when neurons repeatedly fire together, they start to form very strong links. So they form these wire-strong links. Similarly, if we ignore particular actions and don't perform particular actions, those neurons are not going to fire together. And neurons that fire out of sync fail to link is another saying. So this is an actual photograph of some neurons. And as you can see, each neuron makes multiple connections with multiple other neurons. So there's many different ways a message can get from point A to point B. So I'm going to give you a bit of an analogy to news spreading within a family context. So I'm not sure what your family's like, but for my family, news gets relayed something like this. So my auntie might call up my mum to give her some family news. My mum calls my brother to tell him the news. I call my brother, who passes the news on to me, and then I pass it on to my sister, who passes it on to my cousin, who then passes the information along to my grandma. So this is one way that information can be conveyed. If this happens again and again, the connections between these messages can get stronger, and the pathways that the messages travel along can get faster and more efficient. And in fact, what can happen is a totally new and more efficient pathway can be formed. For example, my auntie could just post the family news on Facebook and the news could go to my grandma directly. Okay, so we've got an efficient pathway being a way that neuroplasticity occurs. Another way that neuroplasticity occurs is through what's called cortical remapping. And we can think of this as particular parts of the brain invading other nearby parts of the brain. So before I was talking about how senses of touch end up in a particular part of the brain. So this is where they end up. This is the somatosensory cortex of your brain. So if you put your hand on your head, just behind your ears, this part of your brain here will rest under your hands. If you touch with your finger, that message will be reliably relayed to this part of your brain that represents all touch to do with the hand. If you get touched on your face, the information will reliably end up in this part of your brain that's devoted to interpreting sensations to do with touch on the face. So I'll turn this brain around so you can see it from different views. And as you can see, we have the tongue here, the face here, the body here, and the leg hangs down into the middle of the brain. And I'll come back to that when I'm talking about phantom limb pain. So I'm going to move on now to talk about some examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly to do with neuroscience. So neuroscience can be harnessed and is harnessed when we learn to play an instrument. The more we practice that musical instrument, the easier it becomes and the more automatic it becomes to play that instrument. As our nervous system develops and changes as a result of the practice we're putting in. When people recover after stroke, neuroplasticity is responsible for this. In terms of the bad, as I mentioned, phantom limb pain is an example of how neuroplasticity can go wrong. Similarly, addiction, bad habits, depression, and obsessive compulsive disorder are examples of neuroplasticity gone bad. I'm also going to have a chat about some of the ugly sides of neuroplasticity. So there's a lot of hype around neuroplasticity. It can be used for selling things that may or may not be helpful. And it's also important to recognise that there's limits to how much the brain can change. Okay, but let's start with the good. So here we have a musician. And imaging of musicians' brains have shown that they have particularly developed parts of their brain related to the parts that are used a lot to play their instruments. So for guitar players, this includes areas of the brain related to the fingers. For singers, it's areas of the brain related to the voice box and to the mouth. Musicians also have well-developed temporal areas, so areas of the brain devoted to hearing and interpreting sound. So in the brains of musicians, their hand areas take up quite a lot of space. Now, if we were to build a sculpture from that represented the size of areas in the brain devoted to feeling particular parts of the body, this is what that sculpture would look like. So our lips and our tongue and our hands are particularly sensitive to touch and are able to finely discriminate between touch, and therefore they take up a lot of space in the brain. The more we use these parts, the more space they take up in the brain. All right, so I'm going to talk about an example of the bad of neuroplasticity. Most people who have a limb amputated have sensations that that limb is still there. For some people, that sensation might be extremely painful. And this is thought to be because of a lack of sensory information coming into the brain. So the brain loves sensory information, and it can get really confused when it doesn't have sensation and might become alarmed and start to suppose that something might be going quite wrong and send out these signals of pain. When someone has an amputation, there's no longer messages going up to this hand part of the somatosensory cortex. So the person loses that part of the brain. Now, like Sydney, the brain does not like any vacant real estate, and so nearby areas will start to move in to that part that's not being used in the brain. So interestingly, for a person who's had an amputation, if you were to an arm amputation, if you were to stroke their face, they may feel that sensation of stroking also happening in their hand. If you were to drop warm water on the person's face, they also might have that sensation of warm water dropping on their face. Now, in the case of lower limb amputation, so here's the lower limb, we observed something that's quite interesting. So you'll notice here that the leg is quite near the genitals. So people who've had amputations of their leg sometimes report when they're urinating, feeling the sensation that that urination is actually happening within their phantom leg, or the space where their leg used to occupy. Another example of neuroplasticity gone bad is chronic pain, including pain from knee osteoarthritis. So when the brain is constantly receiving messages of potential damage, changes can start to occur. So those pathways that send the messages about the potentially damaging stimuli start to become very well worn. So the neurons get really used to sending up those messages. Another interesting thing that can occur is that there starts to be some miswiring within the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord here, and messages that are coming in about nice normal touch as well as potentially painful sensations are coming into the spinal cord here. They then join the next pathway and the message gets sent up to the brain. Now, if lots of information about pain is constantly coming in, there might be some miswiring such that normal sensation starts to join with pathways that send up messages about pain. So it can be when a person just makes normal movement, the message is misrelayed and the message ends up in the brain that there's something painful occurring. All right. Now I'm going to touch on some of the ugly aspects of neuroplasticity. So often when you see media reports about neuroplasticity, they'll be accompanied by fancy looking brain images, such as this one here. Now, certainly brain imaging has been a really useful tool for learning more about the brain, but there's great potential for information to be misinterpreted. And there's this very humorous study that was done where some dead salmon were put into a brain scanner and scanned, and lo and behold, parts of the salmon's brain lit up. Now, this was because the machine hadn't been properly calibrated, and it raised the question and the possibility that it's really important for researchers to take good care of their equipment so that they don't end up getting results that are not real. Some other papers have also reported interesting things where if you take a story that's not true, so a scientific story that's not true, and then you fill it with lots of terms to do with neuroscience and neuroplasticity, that tale starts to become believable. So sometimes terms to do with neuroplasticity are used for marketing, for selling ideas, for selling products. And it might be that there's not anything particularly substantial in that. It's just that those neuroscience terms are used to make things seem more important and more real than what they really are. How can you put neuroplasticity to good use? So one of the biggest things I would say is that our thoughts, behaviours and environment really matters. So as you can see, everything you take into your brain and everything you then do creates pathways. The more we do something, the stronger that pathway becomes. So we want to make sure the things that we're experiencing and doing are creating pathways that we want to be created. Another take-home message is to always be a little bit skeptical and to experiment with what works with you. So this idea of N=1 is about you experimenting with what works for you. So some treatments are going to work well for you and some are not going to work so well because you're an individual. But it's certainly worth taking some baseline measurements. For example, you could rate your pain over a couple of days, and then you could try some new things, and then over the next few days take some new pain measurements. And that way you've created your own experiment to find out what works and what doesn't work for you. Another message I think is important is that to remember that pain is a very complex interaction of many systems, and in particular a complex interaction of many parts of the nervous system. So we may not be able to fix a particularly painful part of our body, for example our knee, but we can certainly work on optimizing our lives in other areas so that we can minimize the effects of the pain in our knee. So it's important to remember that we're more than our knee and pay attention to general healthy aging. So some of the things that have been shown to be particularly important for aging well are having diverse social interactions, good close relationships, exercise, and also participating in enjoyable activities. So lots of research has shown that positive neuroplasticity can be promoted through enriched environments. So it's important to live in a happy environment and do what you can to create a happy environment and to change things up a bit so that you keep your brain active. It's also important to embrace new experiences. So the older we get, the more experience we have in doing things in a certain way. Therefore, it can be really good to mix things up a little bit, embrace new ways of doing things so we can forge new pathways. Also, I'd put away any brain games, especially those brain games that you have to pay for, and join an exercise class. So exercise has been shown reliably to help grow new brain cells and to promote positive neuroplasticity. So certainly if you're learning something new, you can then follow that up by doing some exercise, and that will help promote the neuroplasticity with the new activity that you're learning. And importantly, remember that neuroplasticity carries on throughout your entire lifespan. So you certainly can teach an old dog new tricks. Thanks for listening to this talk, something I love talking about, and feel free to send in any questions and I'll address them as best that I can.
Thank you very much, Lee. As you always do, a very good presentation, making a bit of a hard topic quite easy and fun to understand. I actually have received some questions via email, so I might start with one of them. It might get you guys started, so I'll put that one up there, and Lee can answer that question.
Okay, so someone sent in a really good question here. So the question is, can neuroplasticity be used to turn off pain signals associated with osteoarthritis? Now that's a really tricky question, but the basic answer is no. At this stage, we haven't been able to successfully use neuroplasticity to turn off pain signals in a way that doesn't have really negative side effects. However, there's certainly some things that you can do to minimize the effects of pain. One thing that people report finding effective is turning their attention to things other than their pain. So when pain is coming in constantly, it's going to be creating those well-worn pathways. So we don't want to encourage those pathways any more than they're already being encouraged. So if we can find things that we love to do in our lives, find things that are really going to capture our attention, that's one way that we can stop those pathways associated with pain getting any stronger than what they need to do. Another thing that you can do is drown out painful sensations with nice sensations. Now, earlier in my talk, I talked about how there's a few different pathways that send sensory information up to the brain. So there's a pathway devoted to pain, and there's also a pathway devoted to nice touch. So if you send lots and lots of nice touch messages up to your brain, it is able to block out the pathway associated with pain. So for example, you could use things like a TENS machine that sends like a sensation of nice pins and needles into the knee. Or you could use a hot pack or a cold pack, and they just send nice, strong sensations up to your brain, and that helps drain out the pain sensation. Another thing is that we can realize that pain affects our behavior. So I don't know about you, but I certainly know that when I'm in pain, I don't feel like doing other things as much as what I normally would do, for example. This can then lead to negative neuroplastic changes, such that I create habits where I don't move as much, I don't exercise as much, I feel sad. So it's really important knowing that to actively combat it and make that effort to keep up those positive life behaviours that we want to encourage. So continuing to exercise, even if it's causing a little bit of pain, knowing that it's really important for our entire bodies, including our brains, and especially our brains, to be exercising regularly. So I hope that answers your question there, and feel free to ask for any clarification if you need it. And I'm just going to read through the next couple of questions and answer one there. Okay, so there's a question. So how will neuroplasticity help me recover it from upcoming dual knee replacements? Okay, so neuroplasticity plays a really important role for recovery from any injury. So after those knee replacements have been done, you're going to need to learn to use your body without your old knees, with a new knee. Now, a good thing about the knee replacement is that it doesn't have sensory receptors. So you're not going to be getting pain messages coming in through your knee and going up to your brain. A bad thing about your knee replacement is that it doesn't have sensory receptors. It means you're not going to get information coming in about where your body is in space, how you're standing, how you're moving. So your brain is going to have to learn new ways of walking, new ways of balancing. So certainly you'll have information from, your other nearby joints, your hips, your ankles, and from the muscles around your knee. So you won't completely have no idea about where you're standing, but certainly your brain's going to have to learn to optimize that other information and do things in a slightly different way. So as a physio, I guess I can say do the exercises that your physio gives you, because they'll help your brain learn new and good ways of doing things. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the next question, and that is, I have found that pain in my knees is not as troublesome if I'm doing something I really enjoy or if I'm in a positive frame of mind. Is there a connection between sleep and these neuroplastic changes? Okay, some really good points raised there. And so addressing the sleep question is yes, there's definitely a strong connection between sleep and neuroplastic changes. So sleep has been shown to be really important for consolidating neuroplasticity. So while we're practicing something, while we're doing something, while we're experiencing something, changes start to occur. But for those changes to solidify, we need time, and especially we need sleep. So during sleep, our bodies get rid of waste byproducts from our brain, and it importantly takes care of processes responsible for optimizing how our nervous system works. Certainly, this idea that the pain in the knees is not as troublesome if you're doing something you enjoy, there's lots of research to support that. So when we do things we enjoy, it's much easier to get lost in that activity, to really get caught up in the flow of the activity. And because we find it hard to pay attention to more than one thing at a time, if we're really lost in one activity, we'll be able to ignore everything else that's going on around us. So for example, you're perhaps sitting there at home in a seat with some clothes on, and because you've been listening to me, you probably haven't given much thought to the sensation of your clothes touching your skin. Now I've drawn your attention to it, and you'll realize, yes, you are getting that sensory information coming in, but your brain just chooses to ignore it because it's not important to you at that particular point in time. So the next question is, should those nice touch replacement sensations be coming from the same area as the osteoarthritis? No, not necessarily. So that nice touch can be happening anywhere. So anywhere where the touch is going to be strong enough to be drowning out the pain sensation. I would suggest trying it both ways. So I think it certainly can be a bit easier to drown out a painful sensation if you've got a nice strong sensation in that same area. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And just to remind you, some of the examples are cold, heat, TENS machine, massage, brisk rubbing. So this is kind of this is why if we bang our elbow hard, for example, we'll follow it up by briskly rubbing our elbow, and that nice rubbing sensation helps to alleviate the pain from banging our elbow. Okay, so the next question is about phantom limb pain. So the question is, does phantom limb pain tend to be worse for people who've had pain in their limb for a long duration compared to someone who loses their leg in a more acute accident, so they don't have that long lead up to pain? So phantom limb pain is complicated, and researchers are still really trying to get to the bottom of it. But there certainly is there is a number of people who think it's really important to minimize pain in a limb prior to amputation to help relieve or mitigate phantom limb pain. Something that does seem to have an effect even more than pain is what's called learnt non-use. So some people, for example, may have an injury of nerves in their shoulder that's so severe that they're no longer able to use their arm. So they learn that they can't use their arm. Then the arm ends up being amputated. And for some reason, that learnt non-use seems to create stronger feelings of phantom limb pain than, for example, if the person had been able to use their limb prior. Another really interesting thing to do with phantom limb pain is the use of prostheses. So replacement arms, for example. So when the replacement arm is just cosmetic, it doesn't seem to have any effect on phantom limb pain. And if anything, the phantom limb pain tends to be worse. When people have a replacement arm that's useful, so it may be a hook, so it doesn't look aesthetically pleasing, but it's really useful, that tends to be really helpful for alleviating phantom limb pain. So from that, we might take the message that our bodies are designed to be used, and it's good to use our bodies as much as we can. Okay, so someone else has sent in a question to Luciano that says, my physio told me that I have central sensitization, and what is that? Okay, so that is another talk in itself, but just briefly, central sensitization is something that occurs where our bodies can become more sensitive than what they normally would be. So if you think about how humans have evolved, we've evolved to be very alert to potential danger and potential injury, so we can act for our survival and the survival of our community and loved ones. So when we have an injury, messages get sent to the brain, and the brain responds in a way such that it becomes more sensitive to any information that's coming in that area. So you might have had that experience of just, initially hitting your arm, for example, and to start with, you just have pain where you hit your arm. And then after a few hours, the pain seems to spread to a bigger area. And that's partly because the brain has these processes where it starts paying more attention to an area as a way of keeping track of any particular danger that might be occurring. This is very useful for short-term survival because it ensures we take action to protect our bodies, but it's not very helpful in the long term. So if we have pain that goes on and on, that's not it's not anything that's going to kill us or anything that requires immediate attention. It can have that that negative side effect of our brain still wants to pay attention because our brain hasn't caught up to modern times that it's okay to ignore pain. Okay, I have a next question, which is, are pressure points related to neuroplasticity? Possibly. Interestingly, no one really knows for sure what pressure points are. Some people theorize that it's little bundles of nerve endings. Perhaps those nerve endings are a little bit kind of scrunched up and that they're in a particular place. And then the idea is that by pressing on that pressure point, the pain in that area is relieved. So it may directly have something to do with neuroplasticity in terms of it being to do with the way nerve endings have grown. And indirectly, it also has something to do with neuroplasticity in that the pressure point could be an area of tightness. When you press on it, the brain becomes aware of that point being tight and sends out a signal to relax that area. And if you were to do that repeatedly, for example, the brain would learn to keep that area relaxed. Last question. Okay, last question. So the question is, if I move when I'm in pain, will that help stop the pathways associated with pain to the brain? Yes, certainly. So when I was talking about nice sensations, another nice sensation is movement. So if you're able to find ways to move that are pleasant, that can be really helpful for taking attention away from pain in the brain. So I do it all the time. If I get up and my back's a bit stiff, I'll just move around, do some nice movements, help my brain relax, chill out, not be so worried about potential damage. And in that way, I'm able to relax the muscles around the area. So movement can be certainly really helpful for addressing pain. The other reasons that movement is useful is, as I talked about, like exercise is really important for the health of your brain. So when you exercise, you really increase the amount of blood that's going to your brain, which helps optimize your brain function. Also, study after study has shown how important exercise is for brain health. And certainly you'd be best in terms of looking after your brain, preventing dementia, Alzheimer's, etc. Exercise is the thing that's really important, and certainly much more important than any brain training game that you could buy. Certainly, I enjoy doing those brain training games. They're kind of a fun activity to do, but in terms of brain health, it's exercise that's going to have the most positive effect. All right, I think we're out of time. So thank you very much. Certainly, if you send any questions through, I'll do what I can to send you the answers to them, and I'll hand you back to Luciano. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Thank you very much for the answers. Thanks everyone for the questions and for joining us in the presentation today. So as I said before, we were trying this new software. So if you have any feedback regarding the software itself, please email me about it, and I'll be happy to take your feedback on board. Anyway, I will talk to you guys soon again. We will have another webinar at the end of July. We're still finalizing the topic, but I will definitely come back to you very soon about it as well. So thank you very much again for joining us for the webinar, and we really appreciate your help in keeping this program going, because this is we do this to spread information and knowledge. Okay, thank you very much everyone. Have a lovely evening and a lovely week, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.